Hey everybody, Jay Weidner, Reality Check. Thank you for watching. Hit like, subscribe, and all that. And we're going to hit 30,000, we hope, here soon. YouTube is, of course, dragging their heels, and we know what they're doing anyway. They're probably listening, so I better shut up. Today we got somebody I've wanted to have on for a long time, actually. He's written many books, and he's a very insightful guy. And we're going to be talking about a subject that I've been wanting to talk about, but have been reticent to talk about. So let's first introduce, hey, Brad Olsen, how you doing, man?
Hey, Jay, I'm doing great. I've wanted to come on Reality Check for quite a long time, ever since you and I hung out on the rooftop with Jordan Maxwell back at the UFO MegaCon about a year and a half ago.
Yeah,
Really,
right before the what you name hit, and everybody's life changed forever.
yeah, wasn't that true?
A lot of people at that convention got that thing. I heard. I didn't, but I guess a lot of people did. I don't know,
Of
but
course, we lost
fortunately,
Jordan about a year after that too. I
yeah.
didn't.
And then Jordan now is gone,
Mhm.
which is a sad thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was listening to you on Rex's, my good buddy Rex's program, and it was fascinating. And you were talking about, well, you're. I only know two people that have. Oh no, I know three. I know three people that have been to Antarctica. And one's a guy who lives here where I live. He hiked there about 20 years ago, and then Eric Hecker, who's been on the show, of course, and then you went to Antarctica, and where everybody is trying to figure out what is going on in Antarctica. Is that why you went?
Well, it is why I went, because we've heard so many things about what might be hidden under the ice or all kind of mysteries and if you can even get in. And I did shed some light and some travel data on that experience, that indeed our journey had no restrictions. I think where we went, which was the northern tip of the Palmer Peninsula, I went by sailboat for 26 days,
Wow.
was one of those areas that is not restricted. And that is about where 90% of the people who travel down to Antarctica would go. So it seems that they don't really have anything too sensitive there to hide. But for the rest of the continent, I did come to find that there were no fly zones, including over that area near the North or the South Pole where
Absolutely.
Eric Hecker was stationed. And
Yep.
that is the presumed entrance to the inner Earth on the South Pole region.
Yeah. So uh, let's talk about that. So it's clearly obvious from Google Earth that they're whitewashing literally Antarctica because there's just nothing. There's no details. It's just this kind of bland. Every once in a while, you'll see a detail, but for the most part, it's all covered up. And of course, we never see very many pictures of the North Pole. I know a lot of people are thinking I'm a whack job right now, but I do believe that there is some credibility to the hollow Earth. First off, if you studied your alchemy, you know that everything is hyperdimensional vortex. So why wouldn't the Earth? The electromagnetic pole of the Earth is a hyperdimensional torus. So why wouldn't planets be that way? And secondly, if you go to Google and you Google image and you type in, North Pole of Venus, South Pole of Venus, North Pole of Mercury, etc., there's always something kind of odd about the polar regions of all of the planets, every one of them. Just do it. It'll only take you a half hour. There's just something odd. And a French alchemist pointed this out to me years ago about how odd the poles are. And you really can't really look at the North Pole very well. I mean, Google Earth has it, but we don't know what they're doing. For sure, they're wiping stuff off the map. I know that's for sure because there's a base nearby my house which is completely blurred out. So you were in Antarctica. Did you see the ice wall that the flat earthers are always fighting? No, you didn't see
No
that.
such
No,
thing now.
no, I didn't think so.
I
Uh,
stepped on terra firma, Jay. I was definitely on land there. That's
and
it
it
was,
exists.
yeah, it
And
is.
we know that there's flights that go to Antarctica from
Yeah.
Christchurch. It costs $50,000, so you got to have a lot of money, and they'll take you to the South Pole supposedly. But like Eric points out, that you can't see beyond that one little area where they're at, and so there could be anything beyond that. I personally think that's where the secret space program is in Antarctica somewhere, only because they can avoid the Van Allen belts when they're getting in and out. And so that's why I would put it there. And I'd put it underground. You would never see it. No one would ever see it. And so what evidence do we have that we know that there's we had the books, The Smoky God, which is about a Norwegian father and son, and they got caught in a storm and they went through supposedly the North Hole, and quite an amazing story with very large people and large plants inside the earth, and a ball, the smoky ball that gave off light and heat. Is that what got you involved in all of this? Was all these stories that are in the past?
Well, they're certainly intriguing, and I get my hands on anything Antarctica, I'm all over it.
Yeah.
And also, it's interesting that you say that account, because that's very similar to what Admiral Byrd experienced when he was the first flight over the South Pole, and he saw this giant gaping hole approximately 45 miles across.
Wow.
And he felt comfortable enough to drop his plane into it, circle around, and get back out. And what he saw was megaflora and megafauna existing down there, including what he described as a woolly mammoth. That he said, yes, that is an elephant. That's a woolly mammoth of sorts. Now, he wrote his diary, and it's also a hard to get book, but I'm going to track that down because I'm doing another presentation at the conferences next year called Birds Antarctica. And I just want to really pine down and try to get all the data points I can on that, because this could be the best evidence for an inner Earth, one that is totally different from the above Earth, being that frozen tundra of the polar plateau near the South Pole.
And before you go too crazy out there on us, you should, I would look up, I'm trying to remember the name of the artist. He's a graphic novel artist, and he did an animation on YouTube called The Expanding Earth. And it's a really good animation. And what the expanding Earth was started as a theory in Australia about 50, 60 years ago by a geologist. And what he said was that the Earth was originally 1/3 the size that it is now. And it was covered with water, completely covered with water. And that every once in a while, there's an eruption where the Earth starts expanding. And we know the ocean floors date at 200 million years, while the Earth, like where I'm at in Colorado, dates at 4 billion. So the oceans are much younger than the land. And so you can imagine, and also in the center of this Earth, even at 1/3, is a core, an iron core. And as this Earth expands, a gap appears between the iron core, which is at 0 G, because it's floating in the center of the mass. And so it'll stay stable, but the Earth is expanding out and out and out, and this gap grows bigger and bigger, and the holes on the bottom would open up bigger and bigger as the Earth expanded. This would account for why there's no megafauna anymore, because the gravity is increasing. This would account for the paleontologists telling us that the giant dragonflies that they found in the ember could never fly. They're too big to fly. They couldn't get the wingspan. We know that you could not have a 25-foot man on this planet right now because his spine would collapse from the gravity. And everything is getting smaller and smaller, exactly what they say in the Vedic text, that everything will grow smaller and smaller until the end of time when everything returns back to normal. So there is an explanation for the hollow Earth.
Yeah.
And so before you guys go crazy, I mean, okay, so then the oceans would flow in as this thing expanded. The oceans would flow into the hollow Earth, into the lower places, because it would be governed by centrifugal force as opposed to gravity. So everything would be thrown out to the edge of the inside of the earth, just like taking a bucket and spinning it. So there is some, evidence of this, is all I'm saying. And then secondly, I just want to point out that it's kind of odd that FDR sent Nicholas Roerich, the Russian painter, to Tibet to find Shambhala, the inner city in the earth. Why would the president of the United States be interested in such a silly concept if it was indeed a silly concept? But he wasn't. And the monks have said that was all Nicholas Roerich wanted, was information about how to find the tunnel system into Shambhala. All right. So there is a lot of evidence. Now, this guy here, Jan Lambrecht, who wrote this really rare book, Hollow Planets, actually did a deep down dive, and I interviewed him years ago, into all of this. And although he was not concluded that there was a hollow earth, his propensity was to go that way after doing the deep dive. And so that is one thing. And then there's this whole idea that there's this undiscovered country somewhere, and that the people in the flying saucers are actually coming from there. And let's not forget, Admiral Byrd also talked about the flying saucers.
Yeah.
So, right?
On that trip into inner Earth, he lost control of his plane, and he was being directed to land at this emerald type city, a crystalline city, a very advanced looking location. He was a little dismayed that he was being escorted with planes with a swastika on them, and German speaking people who took him to see who he described as the master. And the master was very concerned that the Earth humans had just discovered how to create an atomic explosion, which is something that reverberates throughout dimensions. And this was something the master said that he akined it to children playing with matchsticks in a very dry forest, that we know not the power that we had just harnessed with these nuclear explosions, including what rained down upon Japan to end the Second World War. Admiral Byrd was allowed to leave, and he flew out and wrote it in his diary. He wrote 2 diaries, actually. And the first diary was one that he then turned in to the Navy when he got back. They were very, very interested in that trip, of course. And they told him, you're not talking about this. And they actually even went so far as to admit him into Bethesda, just like James Forrestal, who did not come out alive.
Yeah.
And so Admiral Byrd was wise enough to keep his mouth shut for the rest of his life, but he turned over that diary to his son, who then exclaimed to the world, hey, he went down there and he saw something that he didn't think we'd be able to really wrap our minds around. Now, Brooks Agnew?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, great guy.
Yeah.
He's pure physics on this, Jay. And he also has an incredible diorama of the Earth going through this expansionary phase too, and how the water would recycle itself into inner Earth oceans that he does believe, and even has the GPS coordinates to go to the North Pole, inner Earth, where I'm sure we even talked about mounting an expedition out there, and he wanted me to come along because of my South Pole. Well, now I didn't go to the pole, but going to Antarctica and being a well adapted going into cold climates. And I certainly said yes, but again, the COVID sent that one off the rails. But Brooks Agnew has real powerful evidence that the Earth is much like a torus with holes on the top and the bottom and the energy flowing in and out. And that does make perfect sense, because just about everything in the world, living organisms, are all a torus, including us as humans.
Right. Makes total and complete sense. And there's a great book, Men, Beasts, and Gods, by Ferdinand Ossendowski, I believe his name was. And he was escaping the Bolsheviks during the Russian Revolution. And he went into Tibet And he actually went down into the tunnel systems and met the so-called king of the world, he said, which is again this emerald place that everybody was tall. And also the guy that I've been looking at for years, Fulcanelli, if you actually do a breakdown of his name, it's Vulcan and Canelli, and Canelli is a tunnel or canal in Italian, and so it's tunnel in the volcano. And there's all these stories of the certain volcanoes that have lead you down into the inner earth. Here, just south of me, is Mount Blanca, where the Hopi were taken in to the inner earth at the last catastrophe by the ant people. So these stories are everywhere, all over the earth. The Germans in World War II, well, before that, people don't realize the Anunnaki was obsessed with the inner earth. And they sent people to Tibet. We know they sent people to Peru, to the Andes, to try to find the tunnel openings, which are there, by the way. There are tunnel openings in the Andes and in Tibet and in America that go down into the inner earth. And they're well hidden, you can't find them, no matter how much you try. But they're there. And I believe that, I know this is crazy, but I believe that it's actually true. And I've had long discussion with Agnew about it. And I know that the North Pole is actually freezing up. People don't realize they're getting like 6 inches of ice a year now. And it's getting harder and harder to get a icebreaker into the area where he wants to go. So I don't know. And now that COVID's over, maybe he can get of course, with the Russians, I guess that's going to be a big problem now.
Well, we get all this reports on climate change and global warming and the planet's heating up. Actually, you're right, Jay. It's cooling off. And after that explosion, the volcanic eruption in Tonga earlier this year in January, the degrees are going down in the southern hemisphere. There is still a cloud of ash that's circling the southern hemisphere and creating cooler disease. So Australia is looking at a 50% reduction in crop yield. So most especially in the southern hemisphere, it's temperatures dropping. I opened my presentation called The Hidden Anomalies of Antarctica that I do at conferences with a map of Antarctica showing regions that are warming and regions that are cooling. So there's actually accumulation of ice in certain portions of Antarctica, whereas the area I went to was an area that was rapidly melting. And we did see quite a bit of evidence to show that there was loss of ice, as well as how it is affecting the penguin colonies. So cold water penguins, the Adelie, were actually in decline, where opportunistic, more northern penguins that were coming down into the southern region to get more food were on the increase. That was the Jin 2 and another species that we saw down there that were just taking over where the Adelie penguins weren't making it. So there are changes for sure, but the Earth always goes through changes. But when they happen this rapidly, I guess we can say perhaps humans have some kind of change in that. But Mother Nature, in her infinite wisdom, with this cooling area in Antarctica and then warming areas, doesn't allow the sea levels to come over the top of the rim. And I'm out here just a couple blocks away from the Pacific Ocean, the largest ocean on the planet. And the Santa Cruz Beach Boardwalk, no sign whatsoever that it is going to be encompassed.
There has never been an actuary for an insurance company who has denied a building being built on the beach because of global warming. So I know YouTube's going to go crazy on that, but it's the truth. I mean, that's you. I've talked to actuaries. They believe there's no chance, and that actuaries, that's what they do. They do risk assessment for insurance companies. So they are perfectly fine with building a nice big restaurant right there on the beach in San Diego or wherever. They don't feel that there's any problem, and I don't either. Um, yeah. So. Wouldn't there be, you know how when you open your freezer on a really hot day and you get all that moisture pouring out of your freezer because the cold air hits the hot air?
Yep.
So wouldn't that north opening and the south opening be pretty much in permanent fog, as by the contrast of temperature?
Unless those holes were so ginormous and so deep that it would mediate that heat cold. Or so, for example, up on the South Pole, it's called the polar plateau, and it's just over
Hmm.
2 miles of
Yeah.
ice, and that's pretty darn deep if you go down to the ground level.
Yes, it
So
is.
that's a ways to go. We always say Denver, close to where you're at, is the mile high city. Well, just imagine that times two. That's how high the South Pole is, over
Yep.
10,000 feet elevation.
Yes,
So
it
it's
is.
very dry up there. In fact, Eric Hecker, he's a colleague of mine too. We've talked about it many times. One of the biggest problems they have when they go to the South Pole Amundsen Scott station is static electricity. And you can get really hurt even by the static electric shock because it's so dry there. And while he didn't have any direct knowledge of the hole in the ice, it would be something very top secret.
Yeah.
He had an idea that it could be there, and he never ventured out in that direction where the no-fly zone was. But the NSA, who no such agency, has been tasked
Yep.
since around the time the CIA was created. So was the NSA, and the NSA is they're Johnny on the spot with any crash retrieval, alien bodies, or anything. But
Yep.
they're also present in Antarctica. They have a building at the McMurdo base, totally unmarked building, but that's the NSA operation. And then, of course, they're out at South Pole Station too, if anything's going on. So when I was on with George Norrie, funny little anecdote, we were just talking before the show, as we were before your show, Jay, and I told him about the no-fly zone over the South Pole, and he said, well, why would they need a no-fly zone? Who flies to the South Pole? And in fact, he's absolutely right, because most of the supplies, almost all of the supplies, come in with a Arctic cat. So
Sure.
what you see grooming the ski mountains in North America, that's what they use to pull in the supplies
Right.
along a long chain. And so they really don't need to fly in, but there's a massive no-fly zone right over that area at 89-degree parallel south.
Now, how about the North Pole? There are flights over the North Pole, right? Or are they just skimming the edge of it? But again, it's always cloudy up there. They even say that, the North Pole, when they fly over, it's just looking down at clouds. You don't really see the ice very often.
And at the North Pole, that is always a ice area that it never melts to the pole.
Right.
And one thing I found in the South Pole, looking at Google Earth, trying to find these coordinates where the hole might be, as you said, they use the masking technique where you just see all white. In fact, it's so obvious in some places, Jay, you'll even see some contours and just a perfect square. We're
Yeah.
just not going to let you
Oh,
see
yeah.
that.
Yeah.
They didn't even go to the trouble to have someone with Photoshop try to blend that in. Just nope. Here's a square. You're not seeing what's under. So
Yeah.
we
And
know they're
then there's the question of icebergs. You can't, only fresh ice can freeze like that. So where's the water coming from? They say it's coming from the rivers from Baffin Bay and all of that, but I don't think there's enough there to produce the amount of icebergs that there are in the north, up around Canada. Where's all that fresh water coming from? I mean,
that's a good point. How that much ice in Antarctica as well to in a desert environment. Antarctica is a desert, driest continent in the world. How does it accumulate? 2 miles of ice on the polar plateau. That's just very remarkable. Now, we were down there in a sailboat one day, Jay, and it did snow about a foot on our boat overnight. And we were tasked with the job of shoveling off the snow from the boat. We all had to do chores. We also did iceberg watch. That was the first thing we saw, were these massive pieces of ice that broke off from the Larsen A and B ice shelf that were then moving their way north and melting. And that was the distinction of the Southern Ocean, that there is salt water that is colder and more freshwater induced. And when it hits the upwelling of nutrients coming from the ocean, it's a huge amount of food. And that's what feeds the penguins and the ice. There are ice fish down there that are translucent, that have no red blood. They're clear all the way through. So they have adapted to this very freezing environment. It's quite remarkable the amount of life that can exist in the ocean there in sub-freezing temperatures.
It's on my bucket list, I tell you that. I've always wanted to go there. I've been on every continent but Antarctica, and it's the one place I really want to go, really do. So I'm wondering if you can book like a private plane to go over the North Pole. Is that possible?
You can. Well, in Brooks Agnew, when we were talking logistics about the North Pole ship expedition, they do now even have icebreakers that can be chartered. Usually it was just the military that would be able to do that. But for the first time last year, there was the possibility of booking a charter ship. So if a boat can make it to the North Pole, I would say you could probably charter a plane to go to the North Pole. You can also book a plane to the South Pole. You just have to divert around this big no-fly zone.
Interesting. Well, if there's anybody out there with a lot of money, I'd like to fly there and with my camera and see it. But yeah. So then we look through all the lore, and if you do a deep down dive into occult knowledge and the books that have all been written, you keep bumping up against this thing. And then sometimes it's oblique, and sometimes it's not as, it's hazy, but but it's always there, from the Vedic texts to the beliefs of the Viracocha and the Inca. The Mayan actually believe it too. There's various tribes in Africa who believe it. The Hopi, who I've recently been talking to, believe it. And so there's a lot of indigenous people that actually believe all this.
Well, let's look at it a different way. It's not just belief, it's fact that we create these deep underground military bases. There's over 130 known in North America alone. And this was part of the continuity of government program to create. Yeah, if the surface area was decimated with nuclear war, or we got hit by a meteor, that the United States government would continue in these underground bases. This is why they were started right after World War II. Who came over here and helped advise how to build them? None other than the paperclip Nazis.
Right.
It was the Todt organization, TODT, and he was a master engineer. Some of the old bunkers you can see in Fortress Europe on the coast across from England still have the TODT on them. And what were they doing down in Antarctica? They were looking for locations for an underground base. That was the whole point of going to New Schwabenland. And it was none other than the Admiral Dolence, who said in 1943 that we have created an impregnable fortress for the Fuhrer in a land of ice, meaning they had to go under the continent to get there. In my book, Beyond Esoteric, Jay, I have an image of Antarctica, what it would look like without the ice.
Yeah.
You could see that there are massive fjords that go for hundreds of miles, and an entire river system underneath the ice in Antarctica with lakes. One lake called Lake Vostok is about the size of Lake Ontario. It's one of the largest freshwater lakes in the world that nobody's ever heard about. So combined with the geothermal features of Antarctica, it's also the most volcanic continent in the world. Talk about the land of fire and ice. With 91 known volcanoes in Antarctica and all kind of geothermal features, some of which I saw for myself in Deception Island. It was even written up in the Lonely Planet book. Can you believe it? There's a 256 page tour guide, a travel book by Lonely Planet, all about Antarctica. And one of the excerpts was, you can go to this beach, which we went to, inside a volcanic caldera, and steaming sand and water warm enough, had the tide been going out, could have stripped down our clothes and gone naked and jumped in a hot spring in Antarctica. It was coming in, so we just had to roll up our take off our shoes and socks and roll up our pants and walk through it. And it was plenty warm, but not quite warm enough to go naked on a freezing day and jump in lukewarm water.
So when you were there, did you like notice that how different the sky, the constellations were, and all of that at night?
Oh, definitely. Just like the Crosby, Stills and Nash song,
Yeah.
Southern Cross.
Right.
All the stars are completely different in the Southern Hemisphere. And as we see the Big Dipper in the Northern Hemisphere, they see the Southern Cross down there, and it's quite prominent in the southern sky. But one thing that is lacking is there's no South Star. Like we have the North Star here, and that's what navigators used in the early years to really have an idea where they were in the world. It was a major asset. But when they went south of the equator, there was no South Pole star like that they could use for navigation. It made it much more difficult to navigate through the southern hemisphere.
Yeah, there's a constellation or a nebula that's right at the south, and it's shaped like a turtle, which is why they always thought that the Vedics thought that the world sat on a turtle, because this nebula is shaped like a turtle, and it's the closest thing you've got to a South Pole star, and you need a eyeglass to see it, so you can't see it with the naked eye. So sailors would use that, but it wasn't nearly as efficient as the North Star in the north. So yeah, it caused a lot of problems, especially when you're going around the Horn of Africa and South America. It caused havoc.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
We had the great opportunity of, when we came back, it was 11 Polish people on a Polish vessel and 3 Americans. And they really wanted to see Cape Horn, which is a pyramidal shaped island, the very southern tip of South America. And we got to see it about 20 miles away, home to a lot of shipwrecks, but also home to a lot of weirdness. In 1964, they were scanning the bottom of the ocean near Cape Horn, and they found those very mysterious antenna.
Yeah,
down.
Right.
They weren't sure if the Nazis could have put them in, or maybe
Bruce Cathy. Yeah.
Yeah, Bruce Cathy helped popularize that. So a lot of mysteries down there. And I also want to remind your audience that we live on an ocean planet, that 71% of the whole planet is covered in ocean and water. So really, we're accustomed to living on land, of course, and we think it's a big planet of continents. But really, if you look at the southern hemisphere going north in the Pacific Basin, it's almost all water. So you can imagine how difficult it was for the early explorers to make their way around it. And it was the great navigator, Captain Cook, who did the first circumnavigation of the Southern Ocean, yet he never touched ground. He never set sight of Antarctica. He got below the Antarctic Circle, but never sighted ground. It wasn't until he got back to England and published his journals about how abundant the sea life was with whales and seals, who then prompted all of these soldiers of fortune or merchant marines to go down there and harvest the whales for whale blubber oil and the seals for the pelts. They were the ones who discovered Antarctica in 1821. So that continent has only been known to have existed for a little over 200 years.
So in the Superior East map, which you showed us there, which has Antarctica without the ice, how is that possible? I mean, how can somebody have an accurate map of under the ice in 1590 or whenever it came
Oh,
out.
1513, only 21
1530.
years after Columbus. Yeah,
How
how
could
can
that
you
be?
not? But
I
right
mean,
in the liner notes, there are some notes that Piri Reis, he was a Turkish admiral, and the
yep,
map is still on display in Turkey. He said that it was drawn from source maps dating all the way back to the Library of Alexandria. So how did the people in the Library of Alexandria in the before Christ era know that there was an Antarctica? And actually, the name itself comes from the ancient Greeks. They knew that there must be a landmass to basically balance out the continents in the north. And in the north, they named it after the constellation Arcturus. And so Antarctica was the opposite or the anti of Arcturus, anti-Arcturus, anti-Antarctica is where
right.
that name comes from.
Yep,
Really, hats off to the Greeks to not only calculate the circumference of the globe in
right.
the centuries before
600
Christ,
BC.
yeah, but also to have knowledge that there must be a continent down there. So I think that had passed on even with the time of the Library of Alexandria. And that's not the only map, Jay. There are other maps that also show a landmass down there. And then so after Magellan made his way through the Straits of Magellan, and that was just the 500th anniversary of that,
Yeah,
uh, then a lot of map makers, and you got to understand that the maps of the early world were the most prized possession. That was the first thing.
absolutely.
If you
First.
captured another
Oh, yeah.
boat, you would try to get their map straight away and
Yep,
copy them. They were always held in the most secure lock boxes
yep,
on those early ships. So when Magellan made his way through, then it became common knowledge. And even Sir Francis Drake, in the following decades after Magellan, he got blown off course after going through Magellan Strait, found out that, hey, we're back in the Atlantic. There is no connection to a southern continent. And that's why to this day it's called the Drake Passage.
right. Yeah, he got around. So again, though, there's so much ice buildup on the continent that I'm trying to imagine a scenario where how long ago it was that there was no ice to allow the map to be drawn. Or did they have some kind of ground penetrating, equipment or something? Somebody had something, and it doesn't make any sense. I don't think, okay, there was a cataclysm 12,900 years ago or so. We're not sure what it was. Could have been a comet. We don't know, but it threw us into the Younger Dryas. And but even with the Younger Dryas, I don't think there's enough time in 12,900 years to accumulate that much ice. Do you think there is? It doesn't make any sense.
And that was a warming period too. So if anything, that ice would have been melting,
Yeah.
and it would have exposed those islands. You make a great point there. How could they have known that these islands exist? When I was down at the Palmer base, we got access because there were 3 Americans on our ship. Normally, they don't allow tourists or anybody to come aboard, but because we're tax-paying Americans, they couldn't say no. And in the galley, and I show this in my presentation on Antarctica, he said, take a picture of that ice sheet, which was right out the window on Anvers Island. And I did. And then later on, when we were outside, he said, now look out there. You can see an island that has just come into existence because there was an ice bridge and it collapsed on Pi Day. So they call it Pi Island. But the point is, there is still land masses being discovered in Antarctica, and that Piri Reis map could very well show us where some of those islands exist. And it's quite fascinating that we think we live in a world where we really know all about it and everything's been mapped out, but things still come up that we discover, like Pi Island, that there are new land masses yet to be discovered.
So how about what have you heard like about structures that have been discovered on the island on Antarctica? Have you heard anything?
Well, it's interesting when you pan over with Google Earth, you can find some what look like
Yep.
structures.
Yep.
And why don't they white those out? Are they giving us a red herring? Are they giving us something that maybe is not no longer important or top secret? But perfect symmetry, Jay, with what look like Mayan temples is the best way I could describe it. So perfect four-sided structures with even staircases going up on the all four sides with some kind of top plateau that might have even a structure on top of them. So I have those slides that I show in my presentation. And then there's other places that Dr. Michael Sala had a whistleblower, and he found an area in the New Schwabenland area that was claimed by Nazi Germany that has just been revealed. And this is starting to happen on Google Earth. For example, you can also see the S4 base, which is just outside of Area 51. All of a sudden, boom, they just put it up. And they even call it S4 base with two big bay doors, just as Bob Lazar described it. So he's been vindicated on that one. And then, so when I went to the GPS on Michael Sala's, I did find that it looked like there were buildings perfectly four-sided, even a runway on a bald plateau in that New Schwabenland area. So it's not the best resolution yet, but you can see that there is some kind of structures there. So to answer your question, I would say yes, there is known structures, even antediluvian, or perhaps these were Nazi. This was a Nazi base too that they just didn't want to reveal to the world till recently.
Also, you would think there would be many frozen fossils and things in the ice there. I mean, perfectly preserved, and so you'd think there would be a lot of interest by paleontologists and other biologists trying to find out what's going on down there. I'm surprised they aren't doing more work down there, but maybe they're not allowed. I mean, I don't know.
Well, there's a mountain called Mount Buckley. It's in the Trans-Antarctic Mountain, and it was the route that the early explorers were going up to get to the South Pole. And Scott, who was the second man to reach the South Pole, only 35 days after Raoul Amundsen.
Yeah.
Man, can you imagine the disappointment?
And then he
And
died.
part of the reason the Scott party all died, all five of them, are their bodies are still on the Ross ice shelf. They just couldn't take them out of there. But the reason they got bogged down is because they got to Mount Buckley and they saw all these fossils, and they collected them all to bring them back to the Royal Academy, and they got bogged down with too much weight, and eventually it's what did them in.
Wow, I know, I love that, Scott. They made a great movie like in the 50s about that whole expedition. I remember watching it when I was a kid, being completely blown away by it. And the whole thing, him writing his diary while he's freezing to death, and it was great, great stuff. I've watched every movie about Antarctica there ever is. So what would you do if you had endless amounts of money? What would you do?
Well, I'd mount an expedition to go back. Maybe you'd like to come along, Jay, and go to
Yes,
the New Schwabenland. And
yes.
I'd want to go there because, first of all, I know where they set off to go search for the base that they were ordered to find. And it's in an area called the Schumacher Ponds, named after the pilot who landed the Seaboat on this series of ponds that never freeze. And that's really rare for Antarctica. Well, why? Because they're geothermal heated. So they knew that there was a geothermal vent line going through there, a fault line. In fact, it connects right up to the North Atlantic Ridge. But more importantly is to see if the Allies bombed this area of Antarctica during Operation Argus. And this is still a top secret operation. I do describe it in my book, Beyond Esoteric, because this was alternative one, is to blow holes
Yep.
in the Arctic. What a boneheaded idea. Remember all the ozone holes over the Antarctic. That was really from this Operation Argus.
Yeah.
But what I think it was a cover to bomb the base 211, the new Berlin base, in response to getting our ass handed to us in Operation High Jump.
Right.
which was Admiral Byrd going down there and these craft coming up out of the ice and showing the force. This is what prompted the flyover only a couple years later over Washington, D.C., where all those crafts went over the most
Yep.
guarded airspace in the world. What were those
Yep.
craft? The Honibu 2.
Hanabu.
Those,
Yep.
those were the craft they took out of Germany at the end of the war and took them down to South America and Antarctica. And Admiral Byrd even quipped to a Chilean journalist. He said, "We are going to be confronted with an enemy that can fly pole to pole at incredible speeds." That's what those craft were. And so that forced Truman into having to sign a treaty with the Antarctica Nazis, but I don't think they ever forgave them. And they went down there then in 1958 and dropped a couple nukes in New Schwabenland. So if we went down there with Geiger counters and can prove that that area was radioactivity, that would be quite a find. And I don't think it's ever been done.
I think there was a report around that time period from South Africa where they had picked up some radiation coming in and they didn't know where it was coming from. It was in the late 50s. I remember now. I remember that report. So somebody in South Africa may have picked up some radiation. You might want to look into that. I remember that coming in. Yeah, so just so you guys know, alternative one is where they blow holes in the atmosphere. Alternative two is deep underground military bases. Alternative three is a secret space program. So, and a lot of the people that are being abducted, according to my good friend David Paulides, are of German descent. I asked him that once, and he told me that that was one of the most peculiar things of all of the discoveries that he had made was about 70% of the people that disappear forever are of German descent. Now, the question is, did the Germans get the red mercury from the people in the middle, because the Vimyanas, the Vedic texts say the Vimyanas were powered by red mercury. Anyone can look that up, but the Vedic texts also say there's the gods live underground. So did they? Do you think that they went there and then they made an alliance, maybe?
There's also talk recently that they were given an old Draco base, and that's what they were going to find, that they already had something set up that they could then habitate. It's also interesting at the very end of World War II that they pulled out thousands of young, beautiful Ukrainian women who just went missing. And the presumption is they had all these lonely German scientists that needed a companion. And what better than a hot Ukrainian woman to keep you warm on those cold Antarctic nights?
Well, I've been to Ukraine. Those women are seriously hot, let me tell you. Yes, that could be. I mean, a lot of women were disappearing at the end of World War II, actually, in Germany too. And they were claiming it was the Russians were doing it, but I don't know. It's a strange thing. And then Kubrick talks about it kind of in Dr. Strangelove, to going underground and bringing 50 women for each man, and the women must be chosen for their beauty and sexual attractiveness. Yes.
Aren't we finding out with Kubrick? Man, he was trying to tell us something.
Yeah,
not only in 2001: A Space Odyssey, where they had the whole set built for a moonscape that could have doubled as an Apollo 11 movie set, but also I found out recently in Clockwork Orange that, remember the milk bar they went to?
Yeah.
That was called Renachrome.
No, Drenchrome.
The milk they drank. It was adrenochrome.
It was called Drenchrome, which is short for adrenochrome. And here we are in 1970 when he shot it and wrote it, and he knows about it, which by the way is the same year that the Rothschilds had the Eyes Wide Shut party. 1971, right. And I think Kubrick actually went to that party, by the way. I think he actually went, him and his wife dressed up, and they went, and everything that he saw that night was in Eyes Wide Shut. And
I remember the little boy in The Shining was wearing an Apollo 11 sweater in
Yeah.
a couple scenes. So yeah, he was trying to seed us with some, here's some inside scoop from Hollywood about what's really going on in the world.
Yeah, another interesting thing about that is um, I'm not going to say who, but the guy that was assigned to make the movie Being There in the late 70s with Peter Sellers, he had a problem and he could not make the film. I heard this from someone who was on the film. And Sellers freaked out and called up Stanley and asked him to finish the movie. And I'm sure Stanley asked for, $3 million or something, because Stanley was a really good businessman. And if you watch Being There, there's a whole scene. It's a throwaway scene, and it's Peter Sellers walking around Washington, D.C., looking at storefronts at Christmas time. And on the soundtrack is the jazz version of the 2001 theme by Diodato, a jazz artist from the 70s. And then right when the jazz music hits the Thus Spake Zarathustra part of the jazz music, there's a scene through the window of Apollo 11. So somebody put the theme of 2001 right over a toy scene of Apollo 11 on the moon. And so I really do believe Kubrick probably was the person that ended up finishing that movie and slipped that in there, because, it's just too much of a coincidence. And of course, there's the Diamonds Are Forever with James Bond through the set. And yeah, the whole thing's so silly. But you couldn't even, by the way, take pictures on the moon. It would fry your film would be fried. It's 240 degrees Fahrenheit on the surface of the moon. Your film would just melt in your camera. So anyway, this has been great, Brad. I've been wanting to talk about the Hollow Earth for a long time. I know a lot of people are going to think I'm crazy, but there are many references. I just want to say this. I have a lot of very old alchemy books. They're written in Latin, Greek, and English, and Italian, and there's many, many references to a hollow earth in those books. And I could pull them out. Maybe one day I will, but it's oblique. But they're definitely saying that there's another world on this planet, and that the alchemists come from that world, and that if you really accomplish your alchemical tasks, you will go to, they say, to the east and disappear. And indeed, that is exactly what happens, because one of the goals of alchemy is finding the passage to this hidden land. I'm not kidding you. That is one of the major goals of alchemy, is to find it. And you can't find it until you've gone through these initiations that help you find the path to find it. So you can go on your own, but unless you understand these traditions, you're never going to find it. And I'm not talking about the South and North Pole. These are passages in Tibet, in the Andes. There's one at La Poille in France. Volcanoes, extinct volcanoes, are very much that way, passages wise. And a lot of the mountains in Colorado are extinct volcanoes. So who knows?
Well, but let's not forget that the Nazis were doing expeditions to Tibet before World War II.
So they were.
In fact, when they lost the war, the Russians were going down in the bunker where Hitler died, and they found a dozen Asiatic men that had ritually committed suicide, all wearing SS uniforms.
Yep.
And if it wasn't for a Mongolian in the Russian army to identify them as Tibetan, this might have gone missing from history. But they were there in the Third Reich in the last days of the war, and all had to ritually commit suicide rather than be captured.
There's a book. I'm going to space out. I'll try to put it in the description. It's by a German man who was living in Brazil in the 70s, or was it the 50s? Might have been the 50s. And he met a Native American who was in Native American garb walking around Brasilia and lost. and he started talking to him, and they understood their a mutual language. And the guy told the whole story about how they lived underground in the foothills of the Andes, and they had passages down to the inner earth. And one day the Germans showed up in 1937, I think, flushed them all out with guns, took over the whole area, and that's why he was lost and wandering around. It's a great book, and I'll try to find that because what I'm saying is that what I think is, and I've said this several times, is that yes, World War II was real. Yes, 100 million people died. There's no doubt about it. All right. But it was also a cover for a deep operation I call Project X, which has been going on since at least the time of Napoleon. And it's a series of operations to try to find out all of the occult secrets. And this, I think, is the golden top of the line of all of the secrets. And that's all I'm going to say about it. I probably won't do another show for a while about it, but and I'm probably going to get a lot of criticisms on it, and I really don't care. But you guys should read this one. Read Brad's book, The Esoteric. What's it? Beyond Esoteric. That's a really good book. And Brad, where are you going to be? I know you do a lot of conferences and stuff. Where are you going to be over the next?
Well, they've just pretty much wrapped up for the year, but I'm starting up at Conscious Life Expo in middle February, and then be in Sedona and Mount Shasta in March, and April I'm on a cruise. If anybody wants to find out my schedule and come to some of these, I love talking to people. I'm a people person. Go to bradolsen.com is my website, or if you want a signed copy or see some of the other books that I publish, it's cccpublishing.com. And
very good. All right, Brad.
Good, another conference today.
Yeah, I really appreciate you coming on. It's really been fun. I'd like to talk to you about some other subjects maybe in the future. And I know my audience is going to be excited about this. So thanks.
Absolutely, Jay. Yeah, let's do it again for sure. It was great talking to you too.
All right, everybody. I'm Jay Weidner. This is Reality Check. Thank you for watching. Hit like, subscribe, and all that jazz. And help me build the channel. I want to hit 30,000 next, so we can do it. Thanks.